If tomorrow a person wears a pair of surgical gloves and feels the entire body of a woman, he won't be punished for sexual assault, as per this judgment. Wow, just let that sink in for a second. Imagine hearing this shocking hypothetical laid out by the Attorney General of India right in the highest court of the land. It wasn't just some dramatic thought experiment. It was an urgent response to a very real legal ruling that totally upended how the justice system defines a crime against a child.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking what is easily one of the most intense legal clashes in recent Indian history, the POCSO skin-to-skin reversal. At the very heart of this case is a massive debate over legal interpretation. Think about it. When a law is specifically written to protect the vulnerable, how strictly should courts stick to the literal dictionary definition of a single word versus, the broader spirit of the law itself? We're going to map out exactly how this totally unprecedented ruling happened, the massive public outcry it sparked, and how the Supreme Court ultimately had to step in to fix it.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the controversial High Court judgment.
Let's set the stage chronologically. This whole legal roller coaster really kicked off in January 2021 when a highly controversial acquittal was handed down by the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court. The shockwaves from this decision were literally so severe that appeals were filed almost immediately. Notably, Attorney General K.K. Venugopal brought the matter straight to the Supreme Court's attention during former Chief Justice S.A. Bobde's tenure. This rapid escalation eventually led to a landmark Supreme Court reversal. But what exactly happened back in January 2021 to set all of this off?
Well, the judgment, which was delivered by Justice Pushpa V. Ganadiwala, acquitted a man accused of sexual assault based on some incredibly narrow criteria. The court actually ruled that because the accused pressed the breasts of a child over her clothes, there was no direct skin-to-skin physical contact, right? And without that literal bare skin contact, the court determined the act did not legally constitute sexual assault under the existing law.
To really grasp why this interpretation was so incredibly disruptive, we have to look at the actual law in question, the POCSO Act. That stands for the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act of 2012. Now, this is a vital piece of Indian legislation that was enacted with one specific overriding purpose, which is to protect children from sexual offenses. The entire spirit of the POCSO Act is designed to be a shield. So when the High Court interpreted the law in a way that essentially created a technical loophole for an offender, it raised immediate glaring questions about whether the law was actually functioning the way it was meant to.
Which brings us to Section 2, the dangerous precedent.
Now, what's really interesting here is how quickly the legal community recognized the danger of this loophole. A truly formidable coalition of authorities mobilized immediately to challenge the ruling. We're talking about the Attorney General of India, K.K. Venugopal, stepping in, alongside the National Commission for Women, and even the state of Maharashtra itself. These powerful entities didn't just casually disagree, they actively filed appeals to the Supreme Court. They knew that leaving this judgment unchallenged would set a precedent with totally devastating, far-reaching consequences for child protection across the country.
This really highlights the core conflict of the whole case. On one side, you've got the Bombay High Court's incredibly narrow standard, defining assault strictly by the presence of literal direct skin-to-skin contact. And then on the flip side, you have Attorney General Venugopal's argument, which is grounded in the brutal reality of the crime. He argued that touching the breast of a minor, even without removing the top, absolutely amounts to the commission of sexual assault under the Act. It's a really stark contrast, isn't it? A hyper-literal reading of a single word versus the practical, protective reality of the law.
And the Attorney General absolutely did not mince words when presenting his case to the Supreme Court. He explicitly called the High Court judgment unprecedented and highly dangerous, flat out stating, "This is an outrageous order." He even pointed out a deeply concerning detail from the case itself, noting that the accused had tried to bring down the victim's salwar, and yet, bail was still granted. His conclusion was totally blunt. The judge clearly didn't see the far-reaching consequences.
Let's move on to Section 3, the Supreme Court reversal. Faced with these urgent appeals, the heavy responsibility of correcting this precedent fell to a specialized three-judge Supreme Court bench. This bench consisted of Justice U.U. Lalit, Justice S. Ravindra Bhatt, and Justice Bela Trivedi. Together, they had to meticulously review the High Court's reasoning, the arguments brought forward by the Attorney General, and of course the foundational text of the POCSO Act itself.
And the Supreme Court bench delivered a resounding rejection of the lower court's logic. They officially set aside that controversial High Court judgment. In their ruling, they pointed out that restricting the meaning of the word touch solely to skin-to-skin contact leads to a narrow and absurd interpretation. They basically realized that focusing hyper-literally on the mechanics of physical touch completely destroyed the very intent of the act,
which, as we know, was enacted specifically to keep children safe.
The absolutely crucial point here is how the Supreme Court ultimately clarified the law. They stated definitively, touching through clothes or a sheet with sexual intent is covered in the definition of POCSO. And there it is. That's the cornerstone of their reversal. The Supreme Court decisively shifted the legal focus away from that arbitrary requirement of bare skin contact and correctly placed the emphasis exactly where it belongs, on the sexual intent behind the action.
Finally, let's examine Section 4, the true intent of POCSO.
You see, beyond just overturning a single bad ruling, the Supreme Court used this moment to issue a much broader directive on how laws meant to protect the vulnerable actually need to be read. The bench offered a very clear warning to the broader judicial system, stating courts should not be overzealous in searching for ambiguity in words that are plain. They argued that allowing a narrow, pedantic interpretation just cannot be permitted if it defeats the whole purpose of protective provisions. Essentially, they're saying the justice system shouldn't be tying itself into linguistic knots just to find a loophole that undermines a child's safety.
And to add even more weight to this, Justice Putt actually authored a separate, incredibly poignant observation within the judgment. He pointed out that the High Court hadn't just made a technical error. By coming to that original conclusion, the lower court's reasoning had actively and insensitively trivialized, legitimized, and normalized behavior that fundamentally undermines the dignity of children. He really highlighted the real-world harm that happens when courts accidentally validate predatory behavior through legal technicalities.
This core tension really defines the entire case. We've just seen how a strict dictionary-style interpretation nearly created a devastating loophole and how the Supreme Court had to step in to protect the law's true intent. So I want to leave you with this question to reflect on. When interpreting the law, especially laws designed to protect the absolute most vulnerable among us, should courts look strictly at the literal words on the page, or must they always be guided by the overarching purpose of the protection? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this vital legal precedent. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.